Welcome to the
Club Dub Football Podcast,
where the only question is,
does your team make it into the club?
Can he get in? No, he cannot!
Welcome to the Club Dub Football Podcast. Through the season, our NFL podcast will take you through the slate of games each week. And as we talk through each tie, we'll be discussing who we think will be heading home and who will be grabbing a W and heading on victorious to Club Dub. As well as us talking through the likely winners and losers, we'll also take you to the storylines and superstars on each sideline and get you up to speed with everything you need to know for the games ahead. You can get involved too. Send your questions, predictions and more to us via email at clubdubpodcast@mail.com, or you can find and follow us on Twitter at clubdubpodcast.
So here we are recording our podcast for the divisional round, and 8 teams remaining means that there's still a quarter of the NFL, a quarter of those teams who feel that they could go all the way and win the big one. But it doesn't quite feel that far away, does it? A quarter of the teams is slightly misleading because I think of the 8 left, 8 that feel they've probably got a fantastic opportunity to get themselves into the Super Bowl and maybe even raise the Lombardi Trophy. So in terms of this week, we're going to take you through the 4 divisional round games, and I'm joined again by James Aldrin, Philip Bushby and James Bushby. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hi, Rob.
And in an absolute bombshell, and I know that Twitter has been on, well, tenterhooks really, just waiting for the news to be announced formally. One of us last week on our Pick'em prediction show went 6 for 6. And who was that person? Well, from now on, all I need to say is you can call me Nost Rob Darmus, which means that I get to kick off this week's games. And the game that I'm going to talk you through and start with is our Saturday game where the Rams face off against the Packers. So, gentlemen, for me, one of the more fascinating games of the weekend in that if you look at last week's games the Rams were the epitome of the model you need for playoff football. This is a team who kept what had been at times a hot offense to 20 points, were able to score points themselves, a little bit of help from the defense along the way. But if you're a team that's holding Russell Wilson to 20 points and scoring 30 points of your own when you've got serious questions at quarterback, that feels like a pretty good playoff recipe to me. So the question then becomes, if you can do it against a team like the Seahawks, can you do it against a team like the Green Bay Packers? A bit like the Chiefs would currently have the crown for the AFC, I think the Packers are probably the class of the NFC. So if you're the Rams, you have got the most enormous defensive line. I mean, Donald aside, you've got players that are tall, you've got players that are strong. I mean, against a mobile quarterback like Russell Wilson last week, 10 quarterback hits, 5 sacks, and then you've got all the other problems that a quarterback has getting rid of the ball. The fact that they've got probably the one of 2 maybe true lockdown corners in the league at the moment that only add to the quarterback's kind of headache. Aaron Rodgers, a guy that's had plenty of time to throw behind a great offensive line pretty much all season. Well, without David Bakhtiari, with a little bit of a reshuffle needed for this week, is he going to be the Rodgers of old who's able to fling those balls out, quickly, get the ball out of his hand and find other targets than the superstars? So.
Sorry.
Please wait. This podcast is having an intermission while 3 grown men stop crying after Rob used the phrase flinging out balls when describing Aaron Rodgers.
I didn't say it.
Just let it go. I think it's a really good point you made about the Rams and how well they performed last week. Sean McVay coaches that team so well. And a big part of how they can get at the Packers, I think, will be the run game. And having Cam Akers fit and healthy is a real massive boost to them. The Packers have been vulnerable against the run this year. You saw that massive game that Dalvin Cook had against them, and that was a game in which the Packers eventually lost. So I do think that the run game and getting Cam Akers and Brown and others involved is going to be the key for them. I'm really interested to see how that matchup between Devontae Adams and Jalen Ramsey goes. That's going to be a real interesting matchup. The amount of top receivers that Ramsey has shut down this year is probably 5 or 6. I think he's only allowed 1 touchdown or something crazy like that this year. So it'll be interesting to see how that matchup goes, because Devontae Adams has really been the safety net for Rodgers this year. He's get touchdowns, get yards. So that for me is the key matchup. I'm struggling to pick it really, because I think it'll be a close match. I think it'll be a really close matchup.
I think there's an interesting one in there about, with Jalen Ramsey and what he can do to, a quarterback's first target. I mean, if you think about last week against the Seahawks, I mean, I think DK Metcalf had one, major play, kind of one impact play in the game and very little else. We've seen him do it this season, when I think of them playing against the Cardinals, obviously a game I watch closely, he's able to shut down, D-Hop or ultimately anybody you put against him. The really big question for me about the Packers is, how much love is Matt LaFleur due? I think a lot of talk last season was about, the fact that they had maybe a slightly padded schedule, were they truly as good as their wins and losses record suggested. But I mean, this is a guy who doesn't really seem to be getting that significant recognition that other coaches seem to be getting this year. Yet here they are in the playoffs. They probably go in as the favorite from the NFC as well. And I think a lot of people seem to put that on Rodgers. A lot of people seem to put that on the fact that it's simply a combination of Rodgers finally having a run game of his own, maybe in Green Bay. But it'd be interesting to see what LaFleur can do in playoff football. I think, I think it could be one of those kind of chess matches and those kind of clashes of styles that makes for a really good game.
Well, I think you've made a good point there, because I think you have a superstar undoubtedly on both sides. Aaron Rodgers on Green Bay, Aaron Donald on the Rams. You've got good complementary players around them. I think this isn't just an Aaron Rodgers thing. I think Aaron Rodgers is probably the best quarterback playing today. Not necessarily of all time, but definitely the best that we have in the league at the moment. And previous years, I think it has come down to essentially everything's on his shoulders. He needs to make magic with whatever's around him. Whereas I think what Matt LaFleur and Packers GM Brian Gutekunst, I think that's how you pronounce it, have done very well is build on both sides of the ball. The defense, while a bit of a kind of a no-name defense, is very solid still. Yes, they've had some issues in the run game, but you would still put them above a lot of others. And Devontae Adams this year, Equiminius St. Brown, who are still going and has still putting up points, is great. On the other side, I think the telling thing for the Rams is what happened last week when they started John Wolford. John Wolford went down injured, and then they brought in a recovering from hand surgery Jared Goff. Now, I personally didn't think there was much of a drop between the two, which potentially says more about Jared Goff than it does anything else. But we will probably get into that on another day. I think the Rams will ride Cam Akers. I think you'll see quick passes to Cooper Kupp and the tight ends. I think Gerald Everett and Tyler Higbee will be key players. And ultimately, I think it's going to be one team is going to outlast the other instead of one team necessarily running away with it.
See, I think the Rams' best chance, I mean, it's interesting you say about the superstars, Rodgers on one side, Donald on the other. I think the Rams' chances, obviously, with the quarterback kind of issues they've got, improve if this is a low-scoring game. In a close, low-scoring game, I probably lean towards the Rams. I think if this game opens up, I think you've got to kind of favour the Packers with what they've got with Rodgers under centre.
I think we missed giving a shout-out to Jair Alexander, and I think he is very much like Jalen Ramsey this year in the way he shut top receivers down. So I just thought it was worth mentioning because we haven't really touched on the defensive side of the Packers. And I think that is the best thing that they've got going. Like I said, and James touched on, they're going to run over the Packers in the run game, but Alexander gives them a great shot to slow down somebody like Cup.
The one thing I think the Rams do have in their favour is who is that number one receiver? You look at probably Cooper Kupp is probably the name and the most dangerous, but he's a slot receiver. It's it's a little bit more unusual for your number one receiver to be doing a lot of their work inside. And you've already mentioned the tight ends. I mean, you need a lot of quality in that secondary when you're looking at the Everetts, the Higbees, the various players they can put out.
Yeah, for me, I think you're all way overthinking this one. I can't see anything but a Packers win. I think this is the easiest one to call of all 4 games. Like, the Packers have been great all year, pretty much. I mean, they lost a bad game to the Bucks. They lost another couple of games, I think. But, on the whole, they've looked strong all year. The Rams they look good. They look not so good, a little bit hit and miss. They've, got some key injuries as well. Aaron Donald obviously left the game last week. They've been quite quiet, I think, in terms of how he is, but they're obviously not going to say, oh, yeah, he's really suffering ahead of a game like this because he's their biggest player. But I don't see, if he had to leave the game last week, I don't see him suddenly being magically fine.
I think he's expected to play, and I think somebody like Donald, though, I think he'd play with on one leg and one arm. So
absolutely. There's no question in my mind that he'll play. It's just how effective he can be if he's struggling.
I think Bakhtiari being out, though, is a big thing for that. I think Donald can probably get at him. So I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. A fit Aaron Donald would. Subpar remains to be seen. But regardless of that, Jared Goff's still got a broken thumb. He's not great, in my opinion, when he's fully fit, let alone injured. Wolford they've announced isn't playing, so it's going to be Jared Goff backed up by Blake Bortles. Arguably, I'd put Bortles in. He's got more playoff wins than, since 2017 than Matt Ryan and I think maybe Aaron Rodgers as well. I can't remember.
You are a madman. Nobody can take this seriously. Where are you taking this conversation, Phil?
Well, why not? Jared Goff's been rubbish this year. Why not give him he took the Jags to the championship game, didn't he?
If Jared Goff honestly wanting me to believe Blake Bortles is the kind of person who can carry
as much chance of winning this game with Blake Bortles as they do with Jared Goff. This is a slam dunk. I'll be surprised if the Packers don't win by 2 or 3 scores.
I'll be surprised if the Rams don't start Tim Tebow at quarterback with Phil's assumptions as he's gone.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of time for them to draft someone in, isn't there?
I won't comment on Phil's desire for the Blake Bortles comeback express. But what I will kind of make a point is just I think we need to start a counter every time we start talking about a game to see how long it takes Phil, no matter who's playing, to mention the Bucks.
Yeah, I mean, has that happened?
Yes.
I think we've got a new feature.
The Bakhtiari coming into this season had allowed 14 sacks in 5,000 snaps. Right, that's the kind of level that guy's playing at. And when you start looking at some of his numbers, I mean, forget Blake Bortles' numbers in the playoffs, for goodness sake. When you start looking at those, they're superstar numbers. And the Rams, I mean, they put up more than half those numbers against Russell Wilson last week. 5 sacks, 10 hits. Been interesting. I think, Phil, there's a point you make there, though, that's right. I mean, if Donald isn't 100%, it's not the kind of thing at this point in the season that any franchise would be screaming about. So true enough, that remains to be seen. But we'll save our feelings on Jared Goff, who I'll remind our listeners once took his team to the Super Bowl. We'll save that for the Jared Goff podcast. I'm sure we'll make that a feature of the off-season, won't we? But for me, if I'm going to think about my Club Dub nomination for our first game here, I'm going to say that the team I'm putting into Club Dub is, of course, Phil, the Green Bay Packers. I'm with you. I mean, when the dust settles, the Seahawks is one thing. I think the Packers ultimately is something different. I think they are the class act, and they're the team I'm going to put in. So with the Packers, our first team this week, into Club Dub, that means, Aldrin, I'm handing over to you for your game of the week.
Yeah, and I'm doing the Ravens versus the Bills this week. It's for me, I know we talked about the Green Bay game being one of the most exciting. For me, the Ravens against the Bills is going to be really interesting. It's two of the most exciting quarterbacks in the league going head to head, and it's going to be a real I don't know. I feel like it could end up being a real back and forth game, kind of like you saw the Ravens against the Browns earlier in the season. I feel like it could end up being that. I think you've almost got a guarantee that we're looking at a game over 50 points in total between the two teams. The key thing really is going to be the run game of both teams. And I think that's really been a big part of both teams' game for very differing reasons. I think the Ravens have got the run game really rolling in the last 3 or 4 weeks. Obviously, we know about Lamar and his ability to take off, but J.K. Dobbins has been really exciting, started to take on that lead back role to the point where J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards are now the 1-2 running backs, and Mark Ingram is kind of a bit part player now. Bills, on the other side, have kind of just fallen off a cliff and abandoned the run game altogether almost. I think Zach Moss is down injured. Singletary hasn't been great this year. And I think last week they probably only put up 40, 50, 60 yards of a run game and just flung the ball down the field. So that for me is going to be the really interesting one. I think another part of that is the weather in Buffalo could play a part. It's slated that there's a chance of snow. There's certainly going to be wind. It's going to be wet and difficult underfoot potentially. So I think that plays into the hands of a team with a really strong run game. Obviously, Lamar Jackson hasn't ever played in snow, and that's kind of been made a thing of this week, but I don't think that really impacts his game massively. Flip side of that, Josh Allen for me is probably the most dynamic and exciting quarterback this year. I know we said Aaron Rodgers is probably the best quarterback in the league, but certainly as a player you want to watch, Josh Allen has it all this year. Admit that, having thought last year that he was a 1 or 2 season quarterback before he'd start to pick up injuries and drop out of the league because, you know, he was running a lot, taking too many hits and not being accurate in his throws. Whereas this year he's completely changed that dynamic. He's got his mechanics right. He's throwing the ball so well down the field. Add to that, Stephon Diggs coming into the fold has taken that receiving group to an absolutely next level. Humphrey or Peters, whoever has to cover Diggs, probably both at some points across the course of the game, is going to be tough for whoever has to cover him because nobody has been able to stop him this year, not even some of the top cornerbacks in the league. So Cole Beasley as well, and he kind of goes under the radar, but he's incredible at picking up those, you know, those third down yards to get further down the field. So that kind of makes it for me. I think you're looking at a 50, 60 point game comfortably, and it could go either way. You know, you've got kickers as well that can come into that. And in those windy conditions, who do you want? Justin Tucker, I think, is the guy we'd all take to kick that last-minute field goal if you needed it. So it could even come down to that. But
so I've only got a couple of quick points. Firstly, I want to pick up on what you've said about the media and Lamar Jackson. Every game Lamar Jackson is in, currently surrounded by some controversy about something he's never done before. So last week, I heard he'd never won a playoff game. He'd never come back from a 10-point deficit. The guy comes back from a 10-point deficit and wins a playoff game, and now it's snowy, right? Now we've got to be aware that he's never played in the snow. So the Lamar Jackson thing, I mean, I think I was with JB watching the Titans game, and actually the Titans did really well at bottling up the Ravens run game for quite, you know, significant periods of that game, you know, started so well. But then when Jackson's gone, he's gone. You know, I mean, John Harbaugh talked about that run. You know, this is a guy who can move away from pressure in the pocket, run 50 yards outrunning your defensive backs to put 6 points on the board. I mean, he's an incredible talent. Now, flipping to the other side, we spent a lot of time last week talking about the Colts and how do the Colts beat the Bills. And here's what I thought was interesting. I thought the Colts actually did pretty much everything we talked about. I think Frank Reich was maybe a little bit too aggressive, and, you know, he's been kind of lambasted in the media for his calls on fourth down and so on and so forth. But ultimately, it came down to a quarterback in Josh Allen who was box office. You know, that drive at the end of the first half where he's got, I think, was it 2 catches at least, where he's finding toe-tapping receivers with absolute precision. You know, later on looking off the safety to get that ball to Diggs. I mean, for me, I think Josh Allen in those big moments is just a big-time player all of a sudden.
I just want to touch, Aldrin, you mentioned Cole Beasley. I know.
I'll cut it out. Take a moment. Did Phil just say he wanted to touch Cole Beasley?
He said he wanted to touch me. I just want to touch Aldrin, not on my point, but touch me.
So as much as I've just mocked Phil for seeing how quickly Phil can talk the Bucks into whatever game we're talking about, I'm going to talk about my points related to the Bills and the Ravens by talking about the Bucks. The America's game where the Bucks win the Super Bowl for 2002 season. They go up against the Atlanta Falcons, and this was the Atlanta Falcons led by Michael Vick. And there is what I still remember as John Gruden's locker room speech afterwards when he said, you know, all everybody was talking about before the game was, how are you going to stop Michael Vick? How are you going to stop him? The Bills have to answer the question of how they're going to stop Lamar Jackson. Because Rob is correct. The Titans last week did a great job of controlling the Ravens, getting them down the field in smaller increments, and looked to be on the way to forcing them to field goals. And then there was that massive run by Jackson where he eluded what felt like everyone. The Bills have to control that. For the Bills, we I think have to go back to the 90s to talk about a Bills team that felt as good as this did. And this was a Jim Kelly-led team that went to 4 straight Super Bowls. This year, the Bills swept their division for the first time in franchise history. So as good as those 4 straight Super Bowls Bills were, they never swept a division. This is a different outfit. And as much as the Ravens are keyed on Lamar Jackson, the Bills go with Josh Allen. I said last week he has made a historic transition in his skill set. He had said box office, to borrow a phrase that Rob's used, and I think he can change the game with his legs, or he can extend the play for just enough for someone to get open. If you give Diggs or Beasley or any one of their tight ends a bit of space, they will get a touchdown. We've seen multiple touchdowns this year from Lee Smith, who is a primary blocking tight end. Allen will find open receivers, get them the ball, and especially when they need touchdowns, he will find people for it.
You're right about bottling up Lamar Jackson, but no one does it for 60 minutes. You know, the guy can end up with 100 run yards in a game and 50 can come on one play. You know, he's got that explosive element to him. But I love the fact the Bills are going into this probably feeling like they've got to score points.
I think this is another one where, like I said for the last game, I just think the Bills are too strong. You know, I think you can make an argument for the Ravens winning. I think the last few weeks the Ravens have looked, you know, a lot better than they did, you know, probably mid-season when it looked like they were potentially going to miss the playoffs. But I still just think the Bills look too strong. I think they've got too many parts, you know, like you guys have already mentioned, you know, their receiving core I think is really good and arguably one of the best in the NFL this year. Cole Beasley was playing on one leg on Saturday and, you know, still had a heck of a game. You know, was still getting the first down, still getting the yards. You know, barely looked like there was anything wrong with him. I can't remember if it was the Friday or the Thursday before that game. You know, there was that video that circulated online of them all dancing to "Can't Touch This" or whatever it was. You know, at practice, and they've got that aura around them at the moment. I think where they just look such a strong team. They look like they're together, and I think teams are going to be wary of going in and playing them. And with Baltimore, I just think it's all on Lamar. You know, if he doesn't have a special game, then I don't think they have the parts around him really to kind of really challenge the big boys like the Bills or the Chiefs.
So I think, Phil, my worry about Buffalo you've already touched on. They've got Matt Barkley as their backup quarterback, and obviously there was a chance when they realised they'd be playoff bound when they could have picked up Blake Bortles.
Great point. Absolutely bang on. If only they had Blake Bortles, they'd be a shoo-in.
There is a part of what Phil has just said, though, that I think I don't know if necessarily I agree with it, but if I see some similarities previously, because what you're talking about with how much of a unit the Bills feel, how loose and how calm the Bills feel about this moment. The video of them dancing reminds me an awful lot of the 2015 Panthers the 15-1 team when Cam was the league MVP. They were loving it. I think the Bills kind of have that about them. I think the Colts played them quite tightly. I think the Colts kept themselves in the game, probably with a big performance from Phillip Rivers. And if there's any justice in the world, the Ravens are going to be expecting the same thing from Lamar.
How have we just let those Lamar lyrics slide by?
If there's any justice in the world. That's a very niche gag, I think.
Before we close off talking about this one, I'd just like to say, Rob, playoff wins since 2017, Blake Bortles 2, Phillip Rivers 1, Matt Ryan 1, Russell Wilson 1, Ben Roethlisberger none. Sorry, James. He's the key to victory in that game.
No, you're right. Yeah, bang on. Yeah, that's why he was a fourth string quarterback at the Broncos 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, at the quarterback needy Broncos as well. Let's not fool ourselves.
If Goff has to come out of the game, Bortles is coming in and slinging those balls out.
I don't know if it's controversial or not, but I just think from what I saw of the Bills last week against the Colts, I feel like the Ravens can get outside in the run game. They can put up points. And I think the Bills might just not have quite enough in a close game, admittedly. So the Ravens, who I'm putting into Club Dub this week.
Wrong.
Yeah, it is a bit controversial, actually. Yeah, I think that's sticking your neck out for the Ravens. So, yeah, we'll see how that one goes. So, with 2 games down, it means we've got 2 to go.
My game of the week is, of course, the playoff clash everybody was expecting to see at the beginning of the season. It is the Cleveland Browns at the Kansas City Chiefs. As a Steelers fan who stayed up stupidly until 2:30 a.m. last Sunday night / Monday morning to watch the game, I think there was probably at the time a lot, and has been since, a lot of discussion around the perceived self-destruction of the Steelers. The Browns jumped on every mistake the Steelers made and punished them for it. And we have seen, how many games across how many seasons where teams win the turnover battle but don't get any points. And the Browns absolutely stuck the knife in at every single opportunity. I think the Browns are a good team. I think there's so much talk about, the factory of sadness has been closed. The Browns have made the playoffs. The Browns have won a playoff game. And I think, again, that's doing a disservice to the team for just how well they play. Mayfield is good. Chubb is amazing. Kareem Hunt is fantastic on the field. You've got Jarvis Landry. I'm still not ready to completely believe in them, though. And part of that comes down to the fact that they're playing the best team in the NFL. They're playing the Chiefs. And one of the things that we have talked about repeatedly on game days is the fact that the Chiefs are winning without ever really getting out of third gear. There have been no performances that have blown me away. There's been no performances that have had everyone talking about, oh my God, did you see this thing or that thing? See how big a blowout the Chiefs had. And that, if you're playing the Chiefs, has to be concerning, because you're going up against a team that's got another 2 gears to go up in. You've got to be a little scared. It's Andy Reid on a bye, and the stats show how good Andy Reid is on a bye, setting aside the fact that Andy Reid is one of the best coaches around as well.
I really like your point about gears, and I think we've spoken about this before, because you're right, the Chiefs have never really gotten out of third gear, but they always look like they've got 2, 3 or 4 gears to go through if they need to. I think that was the key to them winning the Super Bowl, was in games even where they were down, and they were down like 14, 20 points. They can just put up 30 points in an instant. And I think that, for me, is the bit that you just can't understate, because you're right, there's been no like incredible blowout games this year where you think, oh my goodness, they're the Chiefs that could just roll anyone. You're exactly right about the bye as well. That, they're coming in fit, healthy, strong. I don't think they've got any concerns about players not being fit. I think Edwards-Helaire has obviously been out for a couple of games, but he's practiced this week. It looks like he was planned to be back for this game. And that offense is just so good.
I'm going to keep my thoughts on this one really short. I think if you're a Browns player, you've got to love this. A lot of people say, we talked about it last week. This is a good season already, right? Whatever happens. But I think there's more to that. I think if you're a Browns player and you've just beaten the Steelers, you think, well, hold on, if we've beaten the Steelers, we can beat the Chiefs, right? We go in with a chance. And if you can beat the Chiefs, you can beat anybody. I mean, if you actually go in and you make it a game with the Chiefs and you're able to get over the line, I mean, what a wonderful narrative for the Browns to just absolutely forget about, these years of misery and Bills fans the same, to be able to just put those behind them. And imagine, say, an AFC championship game between the Bills and the Browns or something like that. I mean, that would be just all kinds of incredible. The Chiefs are surely going to be too strong. But you know what? Who knows? The way this Browns fairy tale's going, who knows how it'll end up.
I think you're right. I think, on the face of it, the Chiefs have way too much. They looked really strong all year. They lost that one game. Well, they lost one game to the Raiders, didn't they, earlier in the season? And then they lost the nothing game at the end to the Chargers, was it, I think, last game of the season? And they just look really strong. Tyreek Hill is ridiculously fast, and Mahomes can just sling the ball down there and he's going to score a touchdown. Travis Kelce, best tight end in the game by far. They've got the running game going with Edwards-Helaire and Bell. They just look too strong. However, I'm going to be the unpopular choice and plump for the Browns in this one, because I don't know if you've seen the tweet from Sammy Watkins this week. I think he was watching the game and pointed out it was almost like watching Madden, with how ridiculous the first quarter was and how the game went. And someone said, at least you'll have some competition next week now. And he put, let's not go too far or something like that, basically mocking the Browns, basically saying that the Chiefs are going to walk all over them. And I think if recent history shows us nothing else, if you underestimate a team, if you're mocking them, if you appear arrogant, it's your downfall. And you only need to look at last week and, Juju saying, well, the Browns are the Browns and all that kind of stuff. That's locker room wall material. You don't even need to do a team talk. You just pop that up there. Even after that game, Chase Claypool, it doesn't matter, the Browns are going to get clapped next week. Well, that's a lot of ammunition and a lot of motivation for them. And it only takes those little things in the playoffs to really push a team over the edge. So the Browns have looked really good, towards the end of the season, I think. The Chiefs could be rusty. Some of them have had a 2 weeks off, if they took the last game of the season off and then they had the bye week, so guys like Mahomes, Kelce, Hill, have going to not played for nearly 3 weeks. Is there going to be a bit of rust there that the Browns won't have? And if the Browns can get up early, can they control the game? So it's going to be interesting. I'm going to go against the average and I'm going to go Browns.
Can the Chiefs do it without Blake Bortles? The question nobody thought they'd ever need to answer, right? Blake Bortles pulling up trees.
The point that Phil made there about, that bit of Twitter back and forth and stuff. It does make a difference. But I think to that point, you look at last week's game, I really do think game script really played into the Browns' hands. They were up by an awful lot of points very early and the Steelers just didn't have enough to get back. I don't think you'll see that with the Chiefs. Phil's point is good because they've got a hell of a lot of motivation. Everybody's written them off. It's an obvious win for the Chiefs in everybody else's mind. But I do think the Browns will go into it really believing they can win, having that kind of impetus and motivation to go and do well. But I think game script really helped them last week, and I don't think they'll have that game script this week. So that's going to be the difference, surely.
But just a final little thing from me before I throw it back to you, JB, for your prediction. We talked last week a lot, and I suppose it's the nature of a pick'em show, isn't it? That sometimes you look back on a game with hindsight and think that the team you were going to pick were actually so obvious. I mean, the Browns went in as underdogs, and the record kind of said so, and so did the history against the Steelers ultimately. This is top of my head. Did the Steelers, with that Browns loss, lose something like 4 out of their last 5, something like that? I mean, certainly, you kind of look at Browns beating the Steelers and you think, well, hold on, if you take that final quarter of the season, the Steelers weren't necessarily the juggernaut they were early on. But yeah, I'm going to hand back to you, JB. Who are you putting in Club Dub?
It's slightly conflicted, and I think part of it is my innate rooting for the underdog that there is a part of me that would like to see the Browns take it, and the Browns go on to the AFC Championship game. But I think it will be a Chiefs victory. I'm going to put the Chiefs in club dub.
So the Chiefs are the third team to find themselves into club dub this week. And who could be our fourth, Phil? I mean, it's a mystery that nobody could really solve. The Buccaneers are playing somebody. So will it be the Buccaneers or somebody in club dub? I'm handing over to you, PB, to round out the week.
Am I allowed to mention the Buccaneers now? Yes, it's our only divisional game of the divisional round. And it's the first ever playoff battle between quadragenarian quarterbacks, if I've said that correctly. Obviously, Breeze and Brady both in their 40s. Everybody, I'm sure, is thinking this is an absolute slam dunk. The New Orleans Saints absolutely played the Buccaneers off the park in 2 games this year. Won both of the games. 2 poor showings from the Buccaneers. Saints outscored them 72-26. Another whooping here, surely. But I don't think that actually tells the whole story. You know, if you look back at those first 2 games, the first game in the Superdome was week 1. You've got a new quarterback, new running back, new tight end, new offense, no preseason, you know, throwing all of those parts together, you know, against arguably the strongest or one of the strongest in the NFC is always going to be a tough one. Go on, Rob.
I need to translate this for non-Buccaneers fans. So can I just take your point about week 1 and phrase it another way? So Phil, your comment about a new quarterback, a new tight end throwing to a wide receiver he'd never thrown before can also be phrased as the greatest quarterback of all time, Tom Brady, along with possibly the greatest tight end of all time, Rob Gronkowski, hadn't quite built up a chemistry.
Well, I don't mean those two
wide
together.
receiver Mike Evans. I mean, I think, come on. I mean, let's not play this sympathy card too much. We're talking about some of the most famed players and most decorated players to ever play the game.
With a new playbook.
I mean, hold on. In week 9, was it? Well, Antonio Brown was taking the field in his first game. So I do apologise that you've got all these Madden cover superstars that
If only they were good players, right?
I mean, yeah. I mean, God, what an absolute handicap that is when you've got Brady still finding his way. But okay, carry on with your point. I'm done.
There was no fluency is my point. You know, they hadn't got it together. And I think if you look at those first few weeks compared to how the Buccaneers have played over the last few weeks, then I think, you know, it's a totally different offense you're looking at. And that's why I think this game could be a different story. You know, there's still been some dicey moments. We've looked good towards the end of the season since our bye week. But, you know, last week it looked like Washington could do the job. You know, you've got a backup quarterback from the XFL, Heineke, who looked great. You know, we couldn't get any pressure on him. The Buccaneers, sorry, not we, couldn't get any pressure on him. So although they've looked, you know, a different animal on offense, the defense has kind of slowed down a little bit.
Oh, sorry, Phil. So I was just going to say, you know, in terms of your points, you're absolutely right. The Bucs have been so much better since the bye week. So that, I think, is absolutely a leveler when you compare it to the games earlier in the season. I think the other thing that I quite like about this matchup is when we talked about the games last week, we talked about the value of coaching and game planning. And I think your Heineke point's a good one. In that Heineke was the quarterback who wasn't expected to play until late. The kind of quarterback that, even though he's not, a prime talent, was just hard to game plan for. You know, how much tape is there out there on Heineke? I think Breeze is a slightly different animal in that they know each other so well. And actually, all joking aside, maybe being able to flip the form table here isn't such a big thing if you're a Buccaneer. That said, my only quick point on the Saints before I chuck it over to you guys is actually we talked about how much like Michael Thomas would Michael Thomas look. And I thought Michael Thomas last week looked a lot more like Michael Thomas than I was expecting. So there's probably a few omens and a few kind of green shoots on the Saints side as well that show they could maybe get something rumbling. But yeah, fair stuff. Since the bye, you're absolutely right. I think the Buccaneers really are on kind of Packers-like pace and trajectory in the NFC.
You know, that's something that we've got to consider. I think we definitely need to get the run game going. I think in the 2 games against the Saints, the Buccaneers haven't run the ball very well. Our running offenses look great, you know, like you say, since the bye. Ronald Jones has looked really good. Obviously, he went down and then Fournette stepped up and has run really well over the last couple of games. And I think that's going to be, you know, we absolutely have to establish the run early on because then that opens up the play action in the offense as well. You're right about Drew Brees being probably more of a a established name in terms of game planning than Heineke did last week. But then you've got to throw Taysom Hill into the mix. And, head coaching candidate Todd Bowles, said this week that you've always got to look out for Taysom Hill to find out where he is. Is he going to get the ball snapped to him and throw it? Is he going to rush down the field and receive it? Is he going to run with the ball? You just don't know. They have so many gadget plays for him that he's going to be a big factor, and he usually is against the Buccaneers. So, that's one to watch for the Saints.
You and Todd Bowles, man. Give it up. Nobody wants him.
3 teams want him. Anyway, the Saints didn't look great last week, I don't think. Watching that game against Chicago, there was it could have been a lot closer game. It could have been a lot more interesting. There was a surefire touchdown that was dropped.
I don't know. I think the point about gears is a really interesting one. I don't think they really had to get through many gears last week to beat that Bears team. And also, like we said, Michael Thomas looked like Michael Thomas. And I think that should be the biggest concern for the Buccaneers. Michael Thomas looking like Michael Thomas would have me worried, because that Tampa Bay secondary is poor. The way that you get at this Buccaneers defense, I think, is over the top, and the Bucs run defense is really good, and how that bottles up Kamara can change the game for me, because Kamara is the player that you want to get rolling early and you want to get involved, because he, for me, as much as we talked about Michael Thomas being Michael Thomas and being able to take advantage of that defense, Kamara is their offense, let's be honest. And you're right, gadget plays from Taysom Hill and all of that kind of talk aside, Kamara is what carries that team, and they live or die on his performance. So I think that's what it'll come down to.
I think had the second best run defense or the first best run defense in the league again this year.
They're great. I think Kamara's a different proposition. Let's not mince our words on that. Kamara is, for me, one of the best, if not the best, running backs in the league. That dual threat out of the backfield is something that's going to trouble the Bucs. But again, if you can bottle him up, that for me stifles that offense.
I think you're underplaying their offense a little bit in saying that it's just Kamara. They've got Michael Thomas, as Rob mentioned earlier, Emmanuel Sanders, they've got Kamara, they've got Cook at tight end and Hill at tight end as well. Taysom Hill, in the running game, they've got Kamara, but they've also got Latavius Murray. I think they do have a lot of parts. They've got
Don't get me wrong. I think they've got a phenomenal offense. I think if you wanted a wide receiver, a tight end and a running back, arguably you might pick those 3. But I think in games where they do well, Kamara is heavily involved and he opens up the field. So that's the only reason I say that. Don't get me wrong. I mean, geez, you've got a Super Bowl winning quarterback, one of the best receivers around, one of the best running backs around, and a top tier tight end from, admittedly, what's not a great pool at the minute. But Kamara is a real big key to that. And him, if you can stop him, you narrow the field in terms of where they're going to go.
Yeah, so you say they're going to have to throw it, and I think you're right. The Buccaneers secondary is probably their weak point. I mentioned it before. We mentioned it with the Chiefs and having that arrogance about them, and the Saints have as well. They've got Cam Jordan, who's already spoken this week about being in the Buccaneers' heads. You've got Lattimore, Janoris Jenkins, and they've got the human punch bag this season, Gardner Johnson. They're going to try and draw penalties. The Buccaneers have penalty trouble against the Saints so far this season. I think that's going to be a big part to play. So
after the Super Wildcard weekend, last weekend, we didn't leave either of those games talking about the team that won. The Buccaneers-Washington game, everyone was talking about what an amazing performance by Taylor Heineke. The Bears-Saints game ended with everybody talking about the fact that Cordero Patterson said the F word live on Nickelodeon and the slime cannons and stuff. What I would like to see with this one is one of these two teams stand out and say, okay, pay attention to us. We need to be taken seriously, and really sort of grab it by the scruff of the neck. Circling back to the very first thing Phil talked about, which is this is the first playoff game between 2 40-year-old quarterbacks or older. We witnessed that Peyton Manning Broncos team that won the Super Bowl, that defeated those 15-1 Carolina Panthers we mentioned earlier. And with the greatest of respects to one of the greatest of all time, it wasn't because of Manning that the Broncos won. It was that DeMarcus Ware, Von Miller-led defense that really took over, and it was leaning on the run game. And it just kind of had happened the season before. I think it was in the playoff game that the Broncos went out on. All of a sudden, Peyton Manning's arm just wasn't there anymore. He couldn't really throw it. I think we have seen that same gradual decline in Drew Brees. And I think the telling thing for that is how frequently they are now involving Taysom Hill in the plays. I don't think it's just because he's a weapon. I think it's also because they need to manage the snap count that Brees has. Brady doesn't appear to be affected by the same things. I think Brady still looks as sharp as he did. And we talk about the way to get to Brady is to get in his face and put pressure on him. Well, I hate to break it to everybody, but the way you get to Drew Brees is you get in his face and you put pressure on him, and Brees isn't in the same physical shape as Brady, despite the fact that he's the younger.
I mean, I think to round out with a few points, and I'm going to throw it back for your decision, PB, in a minute. Firstly, let's all agree then, Tom Brady and Drew Brees, I mean, they're no Blake Bortles at this point in their career. You know, they're in the twilight years for them both, Phil. The second thing is we've brought up Peyton Manning. Let's give the guy his mention and give him credit. Peyton Manning is, without a shadow of a doubt, one of the best three quarterbacks in his family. And throwing it back now to you, Phil. I like that one. I'm glad you like that. I like that gag. Throwing back to you, PB. You're rounding out our week. Last game. And who on earth do you think we're going to be putting into Club Dub?
It's a tricky one, isn't it? I think this is a classic head versus heart. And I think your head tells you that the Saints have got too much. You know, they've already beaten the Buccaneers twice. They look good doing so. You know, they're well coached, experienced coach, experienced quarterback, a lot of veteran pieces elsewhere. But, you know, Tom Brady finds ways to win. And I think he'll be really hurt by those two losses so far this year. I think that could drag us through. So I'm going to go with my heart, and I'm going to say the Buccaneers are going into Club Dub this week.
So the Buccaneers are the last team going into Club Dub. I think probably, Phil, the hardest one to call for me. I think probably more than anything else because we learnt so little about either team last week, really, did we? I mean, like I say, a Saints who ambled past the Bears, Bucks who were, you know, kept honest by a frisky Washington team, but nothing more than that. As a final point, thank you for the near 60 people who listened last week. It was a really nice surprise for us all. Let's hope Sean McVay is one of them and he makes the quarterback change that everyone on this podcast is crying out for.
Too much.
Thanks for listening. Too much. Taking it too far. Thanks ever so much for listening, everyone. We'll see you all next week.
Bye for now.
This is amazing. Woo!
Remember to subscribe and be cool. Tell your friends.
The game